Kia ora ana, talofa lava, talofa ni sabula, malo elele, halo geta, whakaalofa lahi atu, g'day, whakatalofa atu, aloha, warm Pacific greetings to you all, and welcome to this session on eugenics and reproductive justice in the Pacific. So my name is Kate Burry, and I'm joining from Awabakal and Warumi land in New South Wales, Australia. But I come from Taranaki in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I descend from the settler population, or the tangata te tiriti, the people of the treaty. Um, and I am currently a PhD student at the Kirby Institute, University of New South Wales. And I am, in a nutshell, researching reproductive injustice, abortion, and infanticide in the Pacific. And it's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of the presenters today. So just first of all, just to welcome Tina DeLizo, Sandra Widmer, Relma Harrington and Jade Legrees. Welcome to you all. So many of the people tuning in will probably have already been to some of the other sessions this morning. But just to reiterate, so I will begin by just introducing the presentation and the presenter by reading out their bio, and then hand over to the presenter to do their presentation. And then at the end, after the final presentation, we'll all come back together to have a broader discussion. So do feel free to put any questions or comments in the discussion or the chat box. Just to note, though, we may not get to all of the questions, so just to flag that up front. Hopefully we do, but if not, do feel free to send through your question, email them through after the session. So our first presentation today is by Tina DeLizo. So welcome to Tina, and she will be presenting on planting the seeds of eugenics, race, indigeneity, and the Better Babies campaign in Guam. So Tina DeLizo is an associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she teaches courses in critical Indigenous studies and comparative Native histories of gender and sexuality. DeLizo is the author of Placental Politics, Chamorro Woman, White Womanhood, and Indigeneity under US colonialism in Guam. And she is also currently involved in Dakota and Micronesian women's community-based reproductive justice projects. So thank you and welcome, Tina.
Thank you very much, Kate. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So today what I wanted to do was give a glimpse of the historical landscape in Guam and among Chamorros in the early 1900s, and then begin to trace the history of eugenics, which is a move that not many historians or scholars of Guam or Chamorro historiography have done. And so I want to do that, and also begin to think about, well, let me say, in Guam, usually when think about assimilation and eugenics, they're separated and they're mutually exclusive. And so, you know, I'm insisting that that we need to consider these things in the same framework, recognizing the distinctions and the nuances, but also putting them in the same frame. And then I want to end with examples. So looking at the Navy's efforts to control Chamorro bodies, but also beginning to think about and sharing some of the oral histories and the research I've done to really to challenge that, and thinking more broadly about some of the resurgence and resistance movements in Guam around land struggles, but more specifically Indigenous feminist resurgence and resistance movements. Following the Spanish-American War, Spain relinquished its colonies in the Marianas, ceding Guam to the United States and selling the Northern Mariana Islands to Germany. In December 1898, US President McKinley issued Executive Order 108A, which placed Guam under the control of the US Navy. In his orders to Guam's first naval governor, Captain Richard Leary, McKinley described the terms for establishing the United States authority as one of benevolent assimilation. A US Navy report on Guam that was published in 1951 retrospectively described the imperial project as the benevolent long road of gift giving, which came in the form of public health, public works, public education, and the instruction of English. This long road to rehabilitation entailed a transformation in the bodies and minds of Chamorros, delivering them from a disease-ridden medieval peonage to the dignity and demeanor of a healthy, self-reliant citizenry in the modern world. For the Navy, this peonage was the result of 300 years of Spanish misrule, which left the island listless and decimated, and the indigenous people, the Chamorros, a spiritless and mongrelized population, which only the United States, with the Navy as the vehicle, could resuscitate. I'm showing an ad from the early 1920s that begins to really highlight the Navy's project in public works. But you know, there's a language of race in here, and I'm going to be moving quickly, but I also wanted to show some archival footage of, archival images of the Navy's, what the Navy called the long road to rehabilitation. Down this classed and gendered long road, the Navy would look to certain women, white American Navy governors' wives, teachers, and nurses, and it would also begin to look at certain Chamorro women, teachers, mothers, and midwives. Here's some of the earlier midwives that this part of the Navy's Better Babies campaign was to get rid of the midwives, the lay midwives, the late Chamorro midwives, and replacing them with nurse-trained, professionalized midwives. This gendered and classed view of Chamorro motherhood can be traced in a July 1924 special column of the Guam Recorder entitled The Woman's Section. The column, whose author was unidentified, provided Chamorro women and mothers with beauty and fashion tips and instructions on how to care for babies before, during, and after birth. In the first of a two-part series, Chamorro mothers, referred to in the third person singular as the Chamorro mother, are taught that when she learns she is to have a baby, she should go to the doctor, who would tell her how to care for herself, what foods to eat, what exercises to do, and that these steps would ensure the development of a healthy baby and strong race, and remind the native mother that it is everyone's duty, quote unquote, to better their race. A month later, the subsequent women's section reiterated prior US naval governor's sentiments that unsanitary habits and improper feeding, rather than colonial violence, the introduction of disease, and the disruption of the Chamorro social fabric were the reasons for high infant mortality and a decimated Chamorro population. Purporting to bestow a gift of knowledge on matters pertaining to childbearing and childrearing, the column mom shames and reminds mothers that the ultimate responsibility for the prevention of death rests with the mother, and that what was vital and critical to the welfare of the Chamorro race was that motherly love be supplemented by an intelligent comprehension of what constitutes a normal childhood. More than likely, the intent behind this column was to prompt Chamorro mothers to avail themselves to Navy doctors. In this objective, the women's section, like other colonial apparatuses, relied on agents of the Navy to act as surrogate parents and model families to transform Chamorro conceptions of the Mangafa extended family, including godparents, adoptions, other forms of kin relations, and the broader village community responsible for attending to the life, well-being, and afterlife of Chamorro children, and to the American ideal and structure of the nuclear family. A form of surveillance, columns like this, and a so-called Better Babies campaign imposed throughout US colonies helped shape the gendered contours of US colonialism in Guam. The Better Babies campaign, I argue, was part of a larger eugenics movement in the United States, which stressed the idea that properly delivered babies, starting with properly cared for and expecting mothers, made for healthier and superior babies, and eventually healthier and superior adults. In Guam, more, bigger, and better and healthier and superior meant modern, which meant white American. So what I want to do really in these in the next 3 minutes is just this is an actual image from a health fair in the 1930s. And oftentimes you would see images of health fairs with the nurses that were in white uniform who were supposed to represent this Better Babies campaign. I want to show some images of some of the midwives I interviewed whose oral histories really, for one thing, even though these women were trained under the U.S. Navy, what these oral histories really tell us is that they were still holding on to traditional forms of, family structures, the mangafa, extended kinship, that the responsibility of raising the child really rested not just the mothers, but with midwives who didn't just deliver the baby and then come back postpartum, but these were women who continued to have lifelong relationships with the children, the mothers whose babies they delivered. This is an image of another Chamorro midwife who what's really interesting about her is she's really challenging the Navy's efforts to one of the things that they, as part of their surveillance, is the centrality of the birth certificate. And she tells a story of how she's attending to a mother, even to the point where she forgets to go and submit the birth certificate to the U.S. Navy Health Department. So these narratives really disrupt this effort to bring Guam and Chamorro under the Navy's health campaign and eugenics campaign. I would as I'm suggesting. So I want to leave in the last minute. Again, this is something that not many historians have done in Guam history, is to look at assimilation, colonialism, and trace the earlier forms of eugenics. And so I want to do that, and I begun to do that in a book that I published that came out last year. But I'm also looking for my second book project, trying to understand eugenics as part of this earlier campaign, but also thinking about the indigenous feminine movements of resurgence and land struggles, and also and what the more increasingly indigenous feminists in Guam are calling rematriation movements, which have a lot to do with the contemporary climate in Guam, politics rather, and I'm referring here to the recent move, the anti-abortion move in Guam last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, fascinating presentation, Tina. I can tell as well that there's a lot more to be said here, which is always the way when you're dealing with sort of such massive history and massive injustice that is often targeted at women's individual failures to live up to these ideals that are conceived in an environment of great injustice and dispossession and everything like that. So thank you very much, and I look forward to coming back together at the end to hopefully kind of expand on some of these themes. But for now, I'd like to introduce Alexandra or Sandra Widmer, who will be presenting on eugenics and racial capitalism, projections of demographic recovery in early 20th century Vanuatu. So Sandra is a settler scholar and has researched how Ni Vanuatu women have engaged with biomedicine around pregnancy, birth, and infant care in the context of colonial impacts on kinship and women's reproductive health. An associate professor at York University, she has also published on how the Pacific Islands, especially Vanuatu, were part of the global history of racial thinking and demography in the 20th and 21st centuries. And her recent book is Moral Figures, and there's a link to that book in the program that you all would have received. So thank you and welcome, Sandra.
Great. Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. I hope this scenario is properly set up, but my screen doesn't look like it did in the previous session, but I've not presented on one of these webinar scenarios before. Okay, all good, thanks. Okay, so thank you, Benedict, for this invitation and for organizing this amazing 2-day seminar, online seminar. And I'm really quite honored to be on this panel with the other presenters. So our time is short and I'm going to jump right in. So in the early 20th century, racial categories were produced and reiterated by European researchers in the explanations for population decline in the Pacific Islands, and in the ways that the possibilities of demographic recovery of indigenous populations were debated. Maile Arvin argues that such scientific racial categorizations of people in the Pacific reinforce a logic of white supremacy through the possession of indigeneity. Possession of indigeneity through whiteness, she argues, meant white colonial settlers' presence and exploitation of indigenous land could be seen as natural and nonviolent in Polynesian parts of the Pacific. My talk aims to engage with this work to look at how land and labor were intertwined in depopulation imaginaries in a Pacific place, Vanuatu, where people were predominantly classified as Melanesian and where colonialism did not, in a strict sense, take a settler colonial form. When the causes of mortality and low fertility were debated, the researchers definitely worried about the complete elimination of populations in these islands and the causes of what they call depopulation, which I actually see as an extremely problematic placeholder because it's sort of shrouding over extremely high rates of death and low fertility. But that's the language that they had. So the depopulation was debated in eugenic terms, where indigenous bodies perhaps were too weak to withstand incoming disease, or they were perhaps the depopulation was due to inherited causes. But, and this is my focus here, even as a possible disappearance was discussed in the text, in these very same books, these populations figured prominently as potential laborers who could make lands productive for others, whose lands could best be held as so-called reserves for them by the colonial administration. There's a possessive logic in the way that the early 20th century population commentators theorized labor and land. It's possessive in a way that imagines the place of village economies that allowed for cheap labor as a precondition for plantation economies. It's possessive in the way that reserves were put forward as a solution for protecting Pacific Islanders from land speculation, possessive in the way that Pacific Islanders' labor was imagined for the profits of white settlers. In the recovery narratives of the demographic imaginary, Pacific Islanders were not imagined as consumers in the wealth they would be producing, nor necessarily as owners of the land they'd be rendering economically productive beyond their own needs. The demographic recovery narratives are a way into understanding the entangled nature of the imaginaries of racial capitalism and eugenic thought in the Pacific. So, but before I launch into the eugenic thought, I wanted to say that at this same time in the early 20th century, Ni Vanuatu chiefs and in the central region, they held meetings over a period of years from 1912 to 1917. And one of the results of these gatherings is what has been called the Book of Desires, which is thought to have been written in 1919. For those who don't know, Vanuatu was a British-French joint colonial project that British and French took possession in 1906, and Vanuatu re-achieved independence in 1980. But anyway, from this text that was thought to have been written in 1919, it's clear that these chiefs were formulating indigenous plans for the future in the face of the widespread mortality that they'd been facing for several decades at that point. Dick Whakoti Napuakoto had returned to Efate, who's one of the main chiefs who was writing this book. He returned to Efate from Queensland plantation work, and he was stirred to action what he saw of white people misappropriating land and the harsh conditions of work on the plantations. With 56 other chiefs from the central region of Vanuatu, they gave their manifesto to the Presbyterian mission, there's no record of them acting on it. So in a longer version of this paper, I go into much more detail of this manifesto. But in this manifesto, the recovery of Indigenous life is dominated. So the demographic imaginary of these in Vanuatu chiefs was dominated by concern over fairness of being paid properly for the work that you did. It was about fixing and improving the working conditions on plantation, about stopping wage theft, and about Indigenous control over the legal system. So unsurprisingly, the recovery plan in the Book of Desires but I did want to put that in because it is an important part of what was going on, and it's not often talked about in these contexts, and to also highlight the enduring indigeneity, as Professor Kiwani has talked about. So, but unsurprisingly, the recovery plan in the Book of Desires is not quite how colonial commentators of the Southwestern Pacific imagined the future at this time. Take, for example, the work and writing of Edward Jacomb, who was an assistant to the British administration and eventual lawyer in private practice in Port Vila. He was his formal title was a Native advocate, and he also, as I said, had a private practice in the early 1910s. So he eventually published a book called The Future of the Kanaka in 1917. And he says in this book, I think it is fair to say, this is his quote, I think it is fair to say that no man or body of man of any race whatsoever has a moral right to hold vast tracts of land, especially when other nations are in need of room for expansion. In his imagined future, the colonial governments would control white migration and relatedly take control to limit land speculation. And further, he said, a tropical country without native labor is an absurdity. He considers the pros and cons of crown reserves for Pacific Islanders so that they might be protected from land speculation and have land for their subsistence only. He looks to Canada for positive examples of how a reserve system could work as an interim solution. And he said, well, you know, they have residential schools in Canada. Those were, as he called it, an evidence of the inconveniences of splitting up family life. So he said that these would not be necessary in the New Hebrides, not because they were a colossally terrible idea, a genocidal idea, but because there was no prospect of assimilation with the settler population in Vanuatu. I'm already so far. Anyway, so there was a Swiss anthropologist who published named Felix Speiser, who published in W.H.R. Rivers' landmark edited volume, The Depopulation of Melanesia. He was really concerned that people be taught how to work properly, and how that they learn how to recover some of their interest in life, and that they'd be taught things like thrift. And he thought that the government should implement a maximum wage, so that they wouldn't just work for money, they would work also for thrift. And so Speiser, he didn't say what would be done with the profits of such labor, nor why people would expect to do difficult work for a low wage. So the possessive logic expressed in the widespread feelings about balance and labor needs that both Rivers and the commentators in Rivers, both Jacomb and the commentators in Rivers volume, they both are talking a lot about, like, we need to balance the needs of the local people and the settlers, even though the settler population was 900 people and the estimated population size of Ni Vanuatu was 65,000. So with these radically different population sizes, it's easy to see whose needs were privileged in the recovery narratives of balance and mutual benefit and the logic of possession in the demographic imaginaries. All of the authors emphasized the role of the colonial government as moderator of settler immigration and labor migration, and that was really important to generate a labor force for these people. Land tenure should eventually be individualized, and collective land ownership was seen to be a threat to progress. So to conclude, in the scholarly demographic narratives that I've described here, and it was ownership and availability of land for economically profitable cultivation that was of concern. And as importantly, the fertility and productivity monetarily construed of Indigenous people as a future labor force that was highlighted. The recovery narratives were sedimenting ideas and desires about wage labor, profit, cultural difference, and law and order. It was a time of naturalizing the possessions of land by individuals or the crown as a paternalistic guardian. Village life was only important for how it might enable an increased population, and also as a labor force for the plantation economies. Ni Vanuatu were not imagined as consumers of the benefits of the wealth that could be generated. And so it's little wonder that Ni Vanuatu women and men imagined their refusals and recovery in terms of work, and that the chief spoke of desire, spoke of sovereignty and housing for all, and a consideration of the just distribution of wealth. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Again, a lot in there, and a lot of really, really fascinating focus, and particularly looking at, the issues of land and where that fits into a bigger discussion of families and what they have to navigate, and certain kind of ideals, and how that trickles down, that ideals of kind of capital growth and who that benefits and that kind of thing, but also some of the resistances in there, which, as you noted, can be forgotten from that larger discussion of development or whatever it is. So thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. And then I would like to now introduce the next presentation. So Relma Harrington, who will be speaking about eugenics and the use of modern family planning contraceptives in the Solomon Islands. So Relma is a midwife and a senior lecturer from the Solomon Islands. She has been practicing as a nurse midwife for more than 20 years and teaching for 15 years, and has great passion for midwifery practice. She is also involved in community-based research in sexual and reproductive health and women's health. Her recent PhD research focuses on family planning service provision in Solomon Islands, exploring the availability, accessibility, and acceptability of family planning contraceptives in 3 health clinic settings in Solomon Islands. So thank you, and welcome to Relma.
Thank you for this opportunity to be able to present. Good morning from this end. Today I'm going to talk on the elements of eugenics in the use of family planning contraceptive methods in Solomon Islands. Although the use of contraceptives may not appear as a eugenic issue at face value, but I guess as we walk this back into the past and consider why there has been so much controversy and resistance, including misconceptions about its use, I think it is important to relook at it more closely if we want to move the concept of family planning forward into the future, to make it more available, accessible, and acceptable to those who will need contraceptives to prevent avoidable maternal deaths. This map helps us to see where Solomon Islands is located in relation to Australia, including its neighboring Pacific Island countries. Ever since family planning was introduced, it has sparked ongoing controversy, where some people think it's a form of genocide, as it denotes the concept of population control. And in this presentation, I have 8 elements that I wanted to highlight to us, so that we can see what this could mean in moving family planning services forward in Pacific Island countries. So the first element is because it denotes concept of control in pursuit of good health and economical gains that we as health workers or service providers may see, but it's not what the users or clients may see as it is. Second, family planning policies, I'm talking about current policies, they mostly promote modern contraceptive methods than natural or cultural methods, as looking at it as modern contraceptives being reliable versus natural or cultural methods are not reliable. So, like this probably disqualifies other forms of birth control or family planning. And I think this contradicts the cultural norms and expectations about raising families in Solomon Islands as well as in the Pacific Island countries. Thirdly, I was thinking about the use of eligibility criteria checklist, where we group certain clients as eligible and others not eligible. While I understand that these are for the user's health benefit because of risk factors, but probably let's just take a step back and look at what does this mean for people who will want to come and use the service or who will want to access contraceptives. Think about grouping, classifying eligible clients and non-eligible clients. What messages can this bring to the user's mind, the lay people who may not understand all this other information about contraceptives? 4, we mostly talk on family planning goals and targets. Yeah, when we talk on family planning, and family planning goals and targets are set to reach favorable measures, and we have this contraceptive prevalence rates. We want to measure it. When we reach this certain prevalence rate, then we say this is acceptable, or certain birth rates, and these determine whether we achieved or we didn't achieve, or they can also determine success or failure in how we see it and in what we do. But what does this mean for those who use it? And how does this targets really make sense to people who will need to use these services? 5, family planning goals and targets, they accompany specified funds or resources that are available to be used specifically for that method. For example, the Jedel implant, when it was rolled out in Solomon Islands, it has a lot of funding and resources supporting it. So we have very high uptakes of Jedel implants compared to other family planning methods. So this is something just for us to think about. How do we balance all other contraceptives to ensure that women or people understand so that they can use it because it will help them. 6, this notion of taking contraceptives is like taking medications when you are not sick. And then later you become sick when taking medications, like for example, with side effects. So does it mean that you have to be sick or you must be sick to become healthy? Because we want to be in good health to avoid complications. That's why we take contraceptives. But this thinking that I have to be sick to become healthy, I thought that's an element to really relook at it and consider. Eugenics. 7, there has been less emphasis on counseling and informed choices for alternative methods in how current family planning services have been made available and provided. For example, counseling for natural methods. So it's like sometimes we necessarily thinking that these people would never understand or comprehend the menstrual cycle or ovulation method. So why bother talking about all these things? Because they will never understand. For example, menstrual methods or discussing other survival skills in the 21st century. What does it mean? How can we survive with the number of children that we have? And giving this extra thinking to women or to couples, to clients. Looking at cultural values, my last element that is cultural values, beliefs, and practices have been so far blamed to be the main barriers to family planning contraceptive use. But talking about cultural values, beliefs, and practice have been the barriers, I think this could potentially portray a picture of people looking at their cultures as being wrong. It's a bad thing. So maybe it may devalue how people value their cultures. People may now see their culture as wrong because it doesn't agree with the use of contraceptives. And now we start to fight against our own culture to promote modern family planning methods. Just have a look at this and think about this. Think about, could be an element of eugenics in family planning. So, imagining an anti-eugenic future for family planning, I was thinking, with the current thinking that culture is the main barrier, I think we need to look for compatible elements of people's culture that are consistent with concepts of family planning. These things must be sought to enhance delivery of contraceptive use, especially modern contraceptives. So again, it will mean taking a multifaceted approach to promoting family planning instead of just emphasis on contraceptives only. Users, they need to know situations surrounding the use instead of just looking at it as they have to take. Family planning concepts must be presented in a way that is consistent with people's cultural values and beliefs, with the way people think they must understand. So I was thinking about balancing eugenic thinking and reproductive justice and incorporate lay people's understanding or views about the meaning of justice and injustice in their context. And lastly, but not the least, is we should be able to question the status quo to surface underlying influences or intentions. If not, the uptake of modern contraceptives will remain low, and those who mostly need contraceptives may not be able to access them. I think moving forward, we need to re-examine the historical origins to unpack or identify the real issues of perceived eugenics in family planning. Thank you.
All right, well, so yeah, we'll move on to so Jade Legrees, who is presenting on Maori reproductive politics in Aotearoa towards an anti-eugenics praxis. And so Jade is Indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand, from the northern tribes of Te Rarawa and Ngāpuhi. She works as a senior lecturer in psychology and associate dean Māori in science at the University of Auckland. Her research explores the sociocultural context of Indigenous lives informed by colonial pressures and the vibrancy of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Current research projects explore sexual violence prevention, youth well-being, reproduction, and sexual health. So thanks, Jade.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi, ka nui te aroha, kia ora koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, thank you, Kate, for the warm introduction, and thank you very much, Benedict, for all the awesome organising and invitation to participate in this awesome symposium. Just also a mihi to all our presenters. It's wonderful to be surrounded by such awesome people, you know, with a shared kind of kaupapa or goal of thinking about ways that we can be projecting our futures in the face of marginalisation, you know, to the extent of eugenics. So I'm going to just be giving a little bit of a brief overview of some of my work in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. I'll initially start with a bit of an overview, just kind of talking a little bit about our context of colonisation in Aotearoa New Zealand, some of the reproductive discourse and policy that has constrained our lives as Indigenous peoples, in particular our reproductive lives, followed by a couple of examples of work that I've been doing in the areas of abortion and infertility, and then I'll hopefully finish and have time to land on some reflections in terms of what this means, being a Māori researcher and researching reproduction and the kinds of effects and impacts it can have on a person. Okay, so for those who aren't very familiar with Aotearoa New Zealand, we are a Pacific island and around this area of Polynesia, people of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. We're also obviously located here in the sort of broader global context, and you know, share things in common with others who've been colonised, you know, through settler colonialism. So that'll come up a little bit in the talk too. As Māori, we tend to sort of introduce ourselves in terms of the places and people that we come from. Where I'm from in Ngāpuhi, we have a question, koeo, which literally translates to, from what waters do I descend? So koeo, he urioho o Ngāpuhi me te raroa, ko hoki anga nui a kupe, te moana, no motukaraka me Pākana aho, ko Jade the Grice tōku ingoa. So I'm Jade and I'm a descendant of people of Ngāpuhi and Te Raroa. The Hokianga Harbour, the great landing place of Kupe, is the ancestral waters that I connect to. And I'm from places on the north side of the Hokianga Harbour in Motukaraka and the south side of the Hokianga in Pākana. So there's some photos of Motukaraka on the top and Pākana in the bottom there. Okay, so in terms of who we are as Indigenous people in Aotearoa New Zealand, we descend from Polynesian navigators who travelled long distances across the Pacific Ocean. One of our tupuna, our ancestor Kupe, travelled to Aotearoa in the 10th century. Later on, brought a whole lot more people, returned back to his islands, and then brought more people to Aotearoa with him. Māori were then colonised by the British between the 17th and 19th century, and there are too numerous to go into in this particular hui. But it led to the dishonouring of formal agreements and treaties that were set up to uphold Māori sovereignty and self-determination. There were also a series of wars in different regions of Aotearoa New Zealand, and see Vincent O'Malley for further discussion on that. And as we'll probably see on the little picture on the right-hand side, severe land appropriation by the British government or Crown of Māori people, to the extent that I think around 95% of land that was formerly occupied by Māori that then became dispossessed from us between 1860 and 1960. We also experienced drastic population decline from an estimate of around 150,000 in 1796 to around 44,000 in the early 1900s. So this sort of, you know, eugenic kind of sort of movement has been characteristic and present ever since colonisation. So returning to think about what this means for reproduction, government discourse often constructs Māori reproduction as a problem, and there's often sort of spoken about in ways where there's a need to limit, a need to restrict, or a need to control it. And this has sort of taken on different flavours across different centuries. In the 60s, during the time where a lot of Māori were migrating from rural areas to the urban city centres in search of economic opportunities and work, Māori families were considered too big, whether that was through the networks of extended relations that often kind of cohabitated together, or the number of children that people had in the celebration of new life, and a sort of a recognition of the value that children bring to families and to communities. But this led to the national organisation Family Planning to attempt to restrict Māori reproduction through targeted contraception provision. In the 80s, this led to Māori women being prescribed Depo-Provera, an injectable contraceptive, more than any other form of contraception, similar to women of colour in the United States. And in some instances, there are sort of anecdotal narratives of women being given that without their consent. In the 2000s, we saw the high fertility rates of young Māori women. Often it's something that's been constructed as teen pregnancy, when, you know, we might be talking about women in their early 20s. That this sort of young Māori woman having children has been problematised, yet the sort of high rates of abortion amongst Māori hasn't really been given much attention. It's again that narrative of wanting to restrict and control Māori reproduction that takes kind of centre stage. And I think as Tina mentioned, you know, or someone mentioned in one of the talks earlier, that, you know, it's this narrative of sort of saving Indigenous people from ourselves, the government requiring government intervention. And then in the 2010s, the New Zealand government at the time considered compulsory contraception for women who were on welfare or the domestic purposes benefit, of which Māori women made up 38%. Which was a disproportionate amount. So it was we're sort of seeing much more kind of veiled attempts of sort of eugenic policies that are sort of under the guise of something else. In the 2020s, we're seeing long-acting reversible contraceptives, or LARCs as they're often known, that are often encouraged as a solution to the risk of unplanned pregnancy, particularly among people considered and constructed as high-risk populations, including people in low socioeconomic circumstances, Māori, Pacific, and young people, and involved in some collaborative work with Tracy Morrison and a student, Fern Smith, looking at some of the potentially coercive dynamics and sort of patient-provider interactions in that space. So with that overview in mind, I just thought I'd just turn to kind of put the spotlight on a couple of different areas of Māori and reproduction that sort of has shaped a lot of challenges and problems for Māori people to have to navigate. So one is thinking about the kind of discourse, knowledge and health practice around abortion. So around the 2000s, and actually even in the 1990s, there was a really dominant view amongst Māori people that abortion was not tikanga Māori. This was not something that Māori practiced or engaged in. Yet when I dug into the literature a bit deeper, there was a much more complicated story surrounding this. And actually, abortion wasn't linguistically distinguished from miscarriage. So this notion of the loss of conception or the loss of pregnancy wasn't necessarily seen within the same moralizing frame as it did at that time I was doing this research. And actually there were known and accepted methods for causing a loss of conception through, you know, consumption of particular herbal remedies, or, you know, sort of physical manipulations. But this was sort of located as within a domain of women's knowledge and wasn't necessarily something that was brought into the kind of sort of knowledge of general public consumption. So that was a really interesting kind of way of thinking, how has our knowledge around abortion changed? And thinking about, you know, some of the discourse and some of the ways that abortion was spoken about in sort of healthcare contexts, we could see how a lot of, for instance, Pākehā or European psychiatrists were writing about Māori women who they saw for abortions, and the really kind of pathologizing and often kind of criminalizing ways that they spoke about Māori women who were seeking support at a really vulnerable and difficult time in their lives. So there was one author in the 70s who sort of spoke around, you know, abortion as a sort of a way in which Māori women would be eventually trying to get back at husbands who are too overbearing or too controlling, and this idea that Māori men are inherently patriarchal. And similarly, there was the idea that abortion was widely practiced amongst Māori due to sort of the savagery and this relationship to infanticide that was being constructed around Māori women who sought abortion. And then there was another scholar, or a psychiatrist at the time in the 70s and 80s, who took a different view and suggested that abortion wasn't practiced due to Māori superstition, this kind of invalidation of Māori spirituality or distress or grief or loss, instead sort of locating it within a kind of frame that saw Māori cultural practices and ways of meaning, ways of expression as somehow pathological and not to be taken seriously. So this kind of space, for Māori women seeking, to cause the loss of conception in circumstances where this was difficult, we can see, some really kind of harsh narratives around them and their quest for support. So just really, really quickly, just also want to speak into some of the challenges for Māori and Pacific people who experience infertility. So we know that Māori and Pacific people in New Zealand have higher reproductive rates than European people, but sometimes this is conflated with the assumption that Māori and Pacific people also then have higher fertility rates. And that's not the case at all. In fact, Māori people have around the same levels of infertility as European people, and Pacific people actually have higher rates of infertility than European people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And what this means is that there's often a sort of invisibilized or silent space for Māori and Pacific people who are going through these experiences in the context of their communities that puts a lot of pressure on them as individuals, but also on their couple relationships. And in the context of an infertility journey, there can be a lot of really key pressure points like pregnancy loss, miscarriage or stillbirth, trying to seek eligibility for public funding, and going through the process of intensive medicalized treatments that cause really intense psychosocial pressures, and for some actually question them to sort of think about what is their purpose in life, and in a space of hopelessness around this experience of infertility. And I think to add insult to injury, we know that Māori and Pacific people are less likely to seek medical help for infertility in the first place, but there's also barriers in terms of accessing good information. There's challenges with medicalized language, the power hierarchy of a doctor-patient relationship, and an absence really of culturally and spiritually resident information for them to process what this means for them. In some cases, Māori and Pacific people report being turned away from further diagnostic testing, particularly if they have a body mass index score that exceeds the public health requirements for accessing funding. And of course, this particular system disadvantages Māori and Pacific people because we have higher BMIs than European people. These norms are not based on our bodies. So what we're seeing is a sort of an absence of health care, and in some cases it actually leads people who have genuine health issues that are causing infertility to not be investigated, to just this assumption that the weight is the cause of this problem, and then they don't actually get follow-up medical care for genuine health concerns. And sadly, for many Māori and Pacific people who don't meet this public funding requirements, it means the end of the road of their journey of trying to access fertility services because they're just so incredibly, exorbitantly expensive. So I just want to finish on a point thinking about these colonial eugenic legacies and impacts on Māori people and the intensity of actually myself going through a really personal journey with infertility. I started doing research around Māori and reproduction in sort of the mid-2000s. And delayed my childbearing as I was sort of subject to a lot of those discourses that I was trying to resist and push back against. And when it came to my mid-30s, actually realizing that I needed assistance with that. So it was a bit of a brush with the real impacts of these harmful colonial discourses on Māori people, when we're locked in a space where we're either too young to have kids or we're not rich enough to have kids. Then we get to the point where we feel like we might meet all those goals or those benchmarks, and then we're not in a position to be able to do that ourselves. And I was very lucky that I was able to get and access public funding, so that now I'm happy ending, now 28 weeks pregnant with my first baby at 40. So just wanted to share that story in terms of the kind of implications of these colonial legacies on a particular person's life. So tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Jay, ngā mihi nui. That was wonderful. And look, thank you also so much, for ending as well on your personal kind of journey. And it just shows how, these like, this bigger context of injustice, of colonialism, neocolonial, all of these policies and also ideals and how that plays out for people in their lived experience as they try to live their lives and make their own decisions and live their own dreams in terms of family and that kind of thing. So thank you very, very much. Yeah, invite everyone back into the room. And I guess, yeah, I've got so many things that I would like to reflect on because there's been so many interesting things that have come up. But I really want to hear from you all. And I think perhaps an interesting place to start would be kind of perhaps a little bit of that look into that movement of resistance and how people are navigating these really massive histories of injustice, of colonialism. So, there were some mentions of individuals, but also kind of collective resistances. So I think I've been scribbling down a bunch of things, but the rematriation movement that Tina mentioned, for example. So to bring that into a broader discussion of what an anti-eugenics kind of would look like in the Pacific and some reflections on that. So perhaps some movements that you know of, personal experiences, or just kind of reflections on that topic.
I can speak
Yeah.
into that.
Cool.
I think for Māori and
Awesome.
Aotearoa, it's sort of intertwined with kind of cultural revitalisation and the assertion of our sovereignty and the kind of just, shared determination. I think Ranginui Walker refers to it as ka whawhai tonu mātou, the struggle without end. There's a sort of passion to keep going and to honour our ancestors who came before us and to step into those spaces of mana, of prestige, and actually fulfilling those, really rich and incredible legacies of our ancestors before us. So this orientation to whakapapa, or sort of ancestry that comes from the past, that we're influenced by those from the past, but we also influence those into the future as well. And that not need necessarily be biologically, but those that we have kind of relationship with and that we are supporting for our work or our ahua, our sort of way of being, to move into the future really powerfully. So I think that kind of cultural revitalization, the stating of our whakapapa, when we introduce ourselves, proud proclamations of where we're from, the intertwining of sort of land back movements and the sort of reclamation of our cultural taonga, or our treasures, our lands, our waterways, our people, our babies as well, because another thing I didn't have the chance to touch on was the issues with Indigenous children in state care and being removed from their family context. So a lot of Māori resistance and cultural revitalisation.
I have a quick thought about that first question that you posed, Kate. Maybe for starters, expanding or broadening how we understand eugenics, that moves us beyond things these tools, these practices that seem like commonplace. For example, forced sterilization, not to get us away from that, but in the way that we think about colonialism and how that morphs, and we think about new forms of colonialism. At least for me, I'm trying to rethink what eugenics would look like in the 21st century. And I don't know what the answer to that would be. I think it has something to do with taking Indigenous peoples further away from Indigenous ways of knowing, ontologies, and a lot of this might require revitalization, language revitalization work, really looking to those terms that might give us the answers to those, which I see is very much part of the reclaiming of the feminine. In other words, the rematriation movements. I think that's what's really exciting about these Indigenous feminist rematriation and resurgence movements. So yeah, for starters.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. I think there's so much in there. And I definitely acknowledge the point as well around like, you know, acknowledging these legacies, but what they mean today in terms of policy and thinking about, you know, that reproduction doesn't just sort of happen in isolation from these contexts, but also from these broader discussions around land, around language, around, you know, cultural revitalization, around sovereignty, which was never ceded, around access to actual proper kind of welfare. So Jade spoke about welfare policies and how that has an impact. And so moving, which is of course what that reproductive justice theory and movement is about, is moving away from just strict discussion of choice, which makes it about, very easily slips into that privatization kind of discourse of private individuals making and therefore being able to purchase choices, to a discussion of justice. So that probably doesn't do justice being the key word, that doesn't do justice to everything that was discussed today. I hope to be able to collect all of my thoughts and the notes I've scribbled on all of these fantastic this fantastic work that has been discussed today, and to be able to kind of summarize a piece tomorrow as well. So, but I just wanted to finish by really acknowledging all of you and what an absolute privilege it was to listen to you all today. So thank you. Thanks to Benedict as well. Shout out to you for bringing us all together, and thank you also for enabling me to have this opportunity to sort of be here today. So that is the end of our time. We're sort of 3 minutes before the hour. I don't know if anyone else wanted to just have their final say before we sign off. Have anything else that they wanted to?
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, Tina. And sorry about Roma. Well, anyone who wants to get in touch, just to sort of send out emails, because that was a shame, connection issues. Yeah. Awesome.